Thank you all for joining in on our last workshop of the day. And so now we're going to be talking about building a research program. We spent the morning talking about identifying mentors, working with mentors, finding your burning question, that question that drives your work. Once you get to finding what you're passionate about, how do you sort of fight for the things you're passionate about? We spent a bunch of time talking about peer review, getting your work disseminated to your colleagues. And now we're going to talk about that period. After you've worked through several pieces of work, you published a few papers. Now, how do you put it all together? So we're going to do a few things in the next 70 to 75 minutes. We're going to go and talk about the origins of this workshop. It's going to be a nice context for me to let you know of a request I'll make of you. We'll talk a bit about, we'll go back to the beginning of your training and maybe talk about something and reveal some things that weren't quite apparent to you until now. We'll talk about a couple of different kinds of tools that are commonly used in mainstream filmmaking to tell good stories, and we're going to apply it to helping you build a research program, which essentially is a short story about what you're about. What is the work that you do? What can you contribute? And then feel free to ask questions through the chat box at the other workshops. So I want to briefly mention right now, this workshop came from a previous attendee of the forum. We got a comment back in 2018 on our anonymous survey, which I really hope you complete for this year. And the comment gave us an idea. It'd be really great if you take those storytelling tools that you can use to write one paper. If you haven't read it yet, I'll show you a book in a second, which in addition to mine I think are great primers on storytelling and research. And one thing led to another. The idea started as a workshop. Take these tools to connect to build a research program, and turned into the book that came out in April. So if you're seeing something today and tomorrow that you think it'd be really great to see something else next year, I'd like to learn some new things, tell us, because if there's a critical mass, we'll make it. So go back to the beginning of your training. Remember that clip I showed in the morning, that mentor clip, the first time Spider-Man meets Iron Man? I want you to think back to when you first started. Similar way, this is Iron Man mentoring Spider-Man. Think about your relationship with your mentor. What were the kinds of things that motivated you to apply to work with them? What have you done so far? What are the how do these motivations link with each other? And how do they relate to larger things you want to accomplish during your training, and then afterwards, once you go look for an independent research job? Where else do producers of work struggle with these kinds of questions? Motivations, products, trying to link motivations to products. Well, they happen a ton in the movie studio. If you think about every successful movie that you've ever seen, every memorable film you've ever seen, there are tried and true replicable principles. There are things that have considerable overlap or replicability across really well done movies, which in the end of the day are just really well told stories. So why do I use the film industry to communicate key principles about storytelling and essentially building a research program for you? Well, I've grown to think of the film industry as kind of like the NIH for storytelling. What I mean by that is the NIH spends a considerable amount of resources and funds investing in research in the hopes of improving public health. The film industry does something similar. They invest a whole lot of money. It's for profit, but they spend a whole lot of money, trying to produce successful films. And the end result is that each filmmaker is really using a lot of the same principles that we would use to communicate findings, because they want to make sure they get their communication down right. Because if they fail, if they don't tell a good story, then the film makes it so some people go broke. Okay? So, and the interesting thing is, like the NIH, the film industry spends a lot of money on data, focus groups to get a sense of whether or not a film project is something that people might want to see, test screenings after a film is completely drafted, showing it to a bunch of people and saying, what do you think? And sometimes those test screenings make a difference between how a story ends. They might change the ending over things like that, or add new characters, things like that. So all the different things that we see in science, the investment in data and then using data to make informed decisions, is part and parcel of how the film industry functions. And because the film industry has grown to be so risk averse, like if you back in the day when we used to go to movie theaters, actually leave the house, pre-pandemic, anything that was being shown there was usually a character you already read about, or you saw somewhere else. It's a sequel to something that was already successful. The downside of the film industry is that it's horribly risk averse. The upside is that we're risk averse. When we want to invest resources, time, energy, money towards a project, we're trying to design the project well enough so that if something is there, if our hypothesis is right, the data is going to tell us. And if our hypothesis is off, then the findings are going to be inconclusive. But we want certainty. We want replicable principles that can apply to our work. And in that respect, the risk aversion of the film industry works in our favor. Those storytelling principles that we can learn from them are going to wind up helping us. Every great story does three things that we're going to learn how to do and overlay to our own work. Every great story starts by getting you excited in the characters, in the plot line, in the scenery, pulls you in. And you see this new world, and you're saying to yourself, I love this world, I want more of this world. Somewhere in the middle of that movie, the filmmaker ruins it for you. They throw something in the mix and make that world crumble in front of your eyes. A character passes away that you really, really liked. The hero of the story encounters a struggle, and you just have no idea if they're gonna work their way out of it. And then the last piece of the film, it's always the happy ending. I ruin things for you in the middle, but I'm making up for it at the end. Okay? Like every great story does those three things, and it's because that's how our brains work. Our brains are all about patterns, all about seeing patterns. If you go to a talk and the speaker of that talk, and the speaker is doing nothing but fact, bark, fact, your brain's going to turn off. No patterns, bad. Give your audience patterns. And figure out those patterns and how they overlay with how they take in information, and that's where storytelling becomes effective in research. It's not conning people. It's not taking storytelling and overlaying it and saying like, I'm going to spin it for you that doesn't reflect the truth. No, it's taking the same facts that you originally were thinking bark, and instead organizing them in a way that's consistent with how your audience reacts to information. So those exact principles and how we overlay them on research are actually told from the early career researcher's perspective in my book, but a really great primer on storytelling generally is in Randy Olson's Houston We Have a Narrative. It's a fantastic book on this is how I got immersed in story, and it's fundamentally changed my career. It came out in 2015, and it's just a great piece of work. So remember, in the context of your work, storytelling has some interesting caveats in that, like I mentioned before in the mentor workshop, we're all embedded in our mentor's story. We learn the tools of the trade in that context, and then we figure out, well, where do I fit in my mentor's story, and is there a way for me to spin out of this galaxy and create a research program all my own? Now, there are a couple of things embedded in there. For one, mentees don't have complete control over the scholarly process. They can't just go out and study something that's completely, completely unrelated from what the mentor does. That relationship, you're usually bound to a restricted set of questions that you can address in your own way. But the commonality, what we all share in common, is that when we're starting to build a research program, the main goal is to figure out how to tell a story that extends from our mentor's story, that shows a connection. Like, this is where I'm coming from. And also connects to the stories from other scholars doing work related to what the mentor does. So how do you fit in within the galaxy? How do you fit in within the larger universe within which your mentor's research resides? Now, there are a couple of key issues here that we're going to try to grapple with. And we grapple with a couple of these key issues with a couple of different tools that we've hinted about early on in the workshops, and now we're going to discuss them concretely. So as I was mentioning before, a mentor's research program, their galaxy, exists in a larger universe. It's interconnected. They can't just simply move and do something else, from one day to the next, because the rest of the universe is counting on them to address a set of questions that are of value for all of us to know. If that's the case, then a mentor's lab can't quickly change to do something else. And so as a result, what's happening in that lab has a considerable influence on what you do. That doesn't mean that storytelling is impossible, far from it. There are a couple of things that we'll do to address those challenges. The good news about all this is that being embedded in a scholarly galaxy helps a great deal with focusing your attention. You're focused on particular frameworks, particular paradigms, particular theories and methods and measures. And that context is kind of like an incubator. It helps you grow. It helps you develop in such a way, in a controlled environment, where in this safe, controlled environment, you can start getting practice on doing the work. And once you've observed something that's worthy of dissemination, being able to sort of communicate about that work to a larger audience well outside of your galaxy. In an ideal world, you're telling your entire story, this research program, in such a way where you're connecting your work to your mentor and your work to the network of colleagues that also do work that overlaps or relates to what your mentor does. Like I mentioned before, what we're going to do during this workshop is think about these two narrative tools, and in the service of taking multiple distinct pieces of your work, a few different pieces of your work, most likely a subset of your work, not all articles you publish. One of the things that I say is, if you walk into this workshop and you publish 20 papers, congratulations. You're going to ignore most of them, and you're only going to focus on a handful here to tell your story. I'm going to use a set of examples from a grad student in my lab. This is Bridget McCall. She's a fifth-year student in the program. Full disclosure, when I was first figuring out how to convey these tools and try to use examples for how to understand how they show up or how they're revealed in our scholarly work, I asked Bridget, hey, would you let me use some of your papers as examples? I joked with her, look, you and I have never talked about the connections I'm going to make between these papers of yours. So your job talk is actually in this book if you want it. No pressure. Do whatever you want. But there's an example of how you might be able to tell your story in this book right now. All those papers are on Dropbox, and I'm going to go through bits and pieces of them. You don't need to have read the papers beforehand, but suffice to say that I'm going to show you some connections without you having to have read the papers. The first tool we've already started talking about on the margins, and we're going to talk about it very specifically. And it's called the Shared Universe tool, and it's inspired by the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I actually got the idea originally from that clip that I had you guys watch for the mentor workshop. And the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a great metaphor for scholarship. All these different people, all these different characters embedded in a larger set of stories, but each of them is also telling their own story, and in a way that has successive connections. When, for instance, a character like Captain America or Iron Man or at some point Captain Marvel is not only doing that one movie but also doing a sequel and the other movies. A big chunk of where this all starts, where we understand how the Shared Universe tool applies to our own work, is in discovering that burning question, the question that I gave an example of in that first workshop, that first 5 minutes of my talk. Remember my burning question? My burning question was, I'm really curious about why different people often observe the same behaviors in different ways. That's my burning question. Other people's burning questions can be, what happens to kids when they experience early adversity? How do we improve the learning environments in school settings? Right? How do we boost academic achievement in school settings? Things like that. So everybody's got one of those. So the trick is to hone in on what that question is. And what I'd like you to do, since you've already gotten some exposure to that burning question from that first workshop, and we're already talking about some of the part and parcels of what makes a burning question, short, simple, and it's designed to give people a broad view of of the thing that makes you most curious. And in particular, the thing that makes you most curious, where you can point to a few examples of studies you've done that are great examples for how you've pursued your burning question. So practice this when you get home. You don't have to practice this with regards to your burning question. You can practice it with your mentor's burning question. You can just find a few pieces of work where you can see a theme and start explaining it. So even if you don't have one right now, you try to find somebody else's and try to explain it to somebody else. You get your burning question. How does this relate to the rest of the work that you do? Well, like I mentioned in the first workshop, every mentor's lab is kind of like an entire galaxy. It's Andromeda, Milky Way, right? And at the center of all these galaxies is a core question, a core burning question that drives the lab's work entirely. In every one of the solar systems that are embedded in that galaxy, you have separate burning questions that usually relate to that core question in the galaxy. We call those stars, and then concrete instantiations of how you test the burning question. We call those planets. Those planets are individual pieces of work. So your research program is kind of like a solar system in that mentor's galaxy, where that requires having a question that motivates the work, and individual pieces of work that illustrate that question. And just as a preface, that burning question only has to relate to a handful of pieces of work you published, because all of us have been co-authors on papers where we're like, I did it, but it has nothing to do with what I do. I have papers in my record that are about that, where the burning question is, do dogs know what solidity is? Like, do dogs know that one object can't pass through another object? I literally have papers like that in my record. Do I do work with canines? No, I love them, but I don't do work on them. But I had a co-author who did. So all of us have these papers that are at best tangentially related to what we're largely motivated from, and that's one of the key reasons why the second tool focuses on a very small subset of your overall research productivity. So individual pieces of work, connect them to the burning question. So why are we doing this? Well, there's proof of concept in a variety of different bodies of filmmaking, and one of the best examples is the shared universe within the MCU. And in the MCU, you have these individual movies that, when executed well, is telling a great self-contained story. But each of those movies is also kind of like an episode in a television show, because it's thematically connected to other movies in the universe, and really connected to other movies in that galaxy, like Guardians of the Galaxy Part 1, Part 2, actually Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, right? So each of those stories within each other, really well constructed, but then also thematically connected with the ones that follow. And when you start seeing that chain, you're going to start seeing, from movie 1 to movie 2 to movie 3, you're going to start seeing some themes. What does movie 1 do that movie 2 doesn't? What does movie 2 do that movie 3 doesn't? So all this stuff is going to fall into place, when we start learning the second tool. But suffice to say that those individual stories bind to other movies in that same character line, but then also in that entire universe, which is how you're able to go from the very first Iron Man in 2008 to the Infinity War movies from a couple of years ago. Now, I mentioned the stars, I mentioned the planets. Earlier on in the mentors workshop, I also mentioned that there's kind of like a gravitational force that binds the star and the planets together. And that's your theoretical framework. You know, a really good theoretical framework starts from a burning question and tries to answer it as best it possibly can. Right? So why do people harm themselves? And then you have a theoretical framework like Joiner's theory, the interpersonal theory of suicide, as one example, right? So theoretical frameworks are designed to give an answer to a burning question, and then the studies themselves are kind of like tests of that answer of yours. They're tests of that hypothesis that stems from the question. Now, the framework you use could be developed by your mentor. Maybe you developed one. You know, maybe it's drawn from some other kind of framework from another lab, another galaxy in the larger universe. They can come from anywhere. But the trick is to always feel to yourself, okay, this piece of work was motivated by this larger question that then goes down a sequence of events where you say to yourself, I got my question. What do I think the answer is? Is this study a great example of how I test that question? Now, we're talking about how these things connect to each other, and the larger thing, the larger idea that you're probably having is, how big does this solar system have to be? Can it be for instance, can it be composed of only one planet? Can I have a star, a planet, gravity, done, right? Star framework theory, done. You probably can't do that, because the key element of research programs and the key element of job talk, when you actually give a talk to an audience about what you do, that audience is expecting to see you hit some aims, some points. And one of the biggest ones is, can you take an idea and connect it across multiple pieces of work? Can you take disparate pieces of work and connect them into a larger idea? That's going to be one of the things you're evaluated on, whether it's said explicitly or not. But when you go to start scrapping your work, it can't go from one. It can't go from one planet. You got to be able to connect planets together. Now you might say to yourself, how much time do you think I have? I only have a few years in grad school. I only have a couple of years on postdoc. You want me to build a solar system out of nothing? Well, here's the good thing. The good news is, and I've probably already started hinting about this already, is that there are communicative tools, there are principles in filmmaking that allow you to tell a really great story with very few pieces of work, right? And if you've been to the movie theaters in the last 40 or 50 years, you've seen great examples of this. Our next tool is a trilogy tool. Trilogies are great for storytelling. Small number of movies, but still able to tell a larger picture. And you can take that same idea and pick just a subset, just 3 pieces of your work, and tell a compelling story nonetheless. That's our next tool. We're going to actually use bits and pieces of the Scream trilogy to sort of talk about some of these key principles. But suffice to say, I'm not with no clips. Any clips I've ever shown, I've put on Dropbox. Any clips that I've asked you to look at, nothing scary in them. They're just designed. They're just there to talk about the basic ingredients. But the Scream trilogy is a really great example of how to tell this, because not only does it tell a good interconnected story, but the filmmaker, the late Wes Craven, is explicit on what he's doing with each film. It's a great place to look at guidelines. And if you look at Craven's overall approach to storytelling, I mean, he's a horror filmmaker. I mean, how many of us think that the people who make horror films are great storytellers? Well, Wes Craven was one of the exceptions. And it turns out, if you go back to his history, you see a lot of elements of his background that support the fact that he probably could tell some really good stories, and he wound up telling really good stories. He had a background in psychology. It was one of his majors in undergrad. And he probably got a lot of really great ideas about how audiences react to stories. Because when you see a horror film, whether it's with your friends or loved ones at home, or you're in an audience in a brick and mortar movie theater, you don't just watch this movie, you interact with it. Oh, don't go in there, stuff like that. Like you interact with the film, right? And the way Craven thinks about it is, being a member of an audience while you're watching a horror movie is a visceral experience, but also it's a shared experience, because the way he sees it, when you scream and you hear everyone else scream, you realize that the fears are not within you, they're in everyone else. And in some ways, it lets the audience go. It's almost like being on a roller coaster. It's activating you, like you're getting amped up, but you're doing it in a very controlled environment, right? And so Craven used these really useful storytelling devices when talking about horror film stories, and to do it in a way where he's assuming that he's not making people feel happy. He's making people feel like aversive things, like the kind of stuff you feel if you see a spider and you're afraid of spiders, or a snake if you're afraid of snakes. And he's leveraging the idea that tend to see these films together, like to get through the rough parts. You know where you see that too? You see that when you give a job talk. You're not scaring them. You're making them feel good. You're making them think about things they never thought before. But your goal really is to take a set of ideas, the work that you've done, and evoke positive emotions from your audience. Because when you're doing that, the audience is going to wind up banding together to root for you. They want to get more ideas. They want to choose their ideas. They want to ask you questions. So the whole idea is to play to your audience. And you do that with really great storytelling. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you a set of guidelines for selecting your articles. I'm going to call them movies. You're going to be a film producer now. I'm going to give you guidelines for not only which movies to pick, but also how to organize them, what their sequence is going to be. We're going to call those the Trilogy guidelines. Right? And they derive directly from Craven's own thinking about how to tell stories across films in a really cohesive way. First thing you got to do, and I kind of already hinted at it before, make people care. Movie 1 does that. Movie 2 continues the plot line from movie 1, but inserts a conflict. Think, Luke, I'm your father. That was a big moment in the second Star Wars film. And then the last one uses the element of surprise, right? But it does so in a particular way, right? Princess Leia is my sister? Yeah, that was in the third movie. Yeah. So each of these things show overlap in a variety of different trilogy contexts that you've seen before. So, deep character development. Making people care in a movie context involves getting an audience to see a piece of information, see a storyline, a plot line, and get committed to the well-being of the people involved, or the data being reported, what have you. And in a horror film context, it works great, because what happens is an audience gets pulled in to Sidney Prescott, or was the lead character and protagonist in the first 3 Scream movies. And when you get people committed, what Craven would call care before you scare, then if anything bad happens to them, like the conflict in the middle, it throws everybody off. Oh no, bad news. What's going to happen to everybody else? I hope they make it through. So that initial starting point, pulling your audience in, picking a movie that is the instantiation of, man, if you're gonna care about anything that I'm doing here, this is gonna pique your curiosity the most. And then once you get your audience pulled in and you understand what the plot line is, you understand the element of the work that gets you most intrigued, then you hook them. Then you hook them on this plot line, and you take that plot line into the next movie. That's why a lot of times the sequels aren't doing something that's all that different from the first movie. They're just doing it more intensely. There's more action in the action movie. In the horror movie, the sequel to the first movie, more people perish. That kind of stuff. But it's the same continuation of an underlying plot line that then you use in the service of working of producing the third movie. But we're going to get to the sequel in a second. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how that movie gets instantiated in research. What does that look like in research? So as you're thinking about that first movie in your trilogy, think back to your projects. It could be the first one that got you excited about your work. It doesn't have to be. It could be one of the last things that you did where you're like, this is actually the best I got here in terms of like the work, the thing you got you most proud. Maybe the first paper where you said, yeah, I'm really interested in this question. I want to do more of this. If you're that excited, chances are the audience will get that excited too. So as an example, a couple of years ago, Bridget published her thesis. Now she did her thesis with Antonio Polo, who's a professor over at DePaul. So she did this thing before she ever worked with us in my lab. And so like the nice thing about this is that this is, the trilogy I'm showing you. I had no design input on the first on the first of these. On the first of these studies, I think I gave Bridget advice on a couple of things in this paper, but she did stuff on her own under the supervision of Antonio. In that take-home message, you remember to go back to that my burning question: why do people see the same things in different ways? So we didn't know a ton of that, the answer to that question for depression. When you assess depression in children and adolescents, parents and kids often have very different responses, right? Very different responses about the kid's depression. Parents sees one thing about the kid's depression, kid sees another thing about their depression. And for a long time, a lot of my colleagues and I thought, what is this? Is this all measurement error? Is somebody biased? We didn't really know that there was any coherence in the patterns of scores of depression when multiple people providing reports about the same person's depression. So Bridget's first movie is really exciting. Not only was she able to identify reliable patterns in these discrepancies in reports, it turns out, yeah, on average in a sample, kids and parents provide reports that correlate off 0.2. And you might think to yourself, that means none of them agree. It's like, actually, no, some do. In any one sample, you're going to find a subset of kids and parents that actually see eye to eye on how depressed the child might be, right? None at all, or very little, or a whole lot. But then you might also have some other kids in there that see depression the parents don't, or the parents see depression the kids don't, and that those stable patterns actually relate to key clinical outcomes relevant to understanding and treating depression. And so that first study of Bridget's is great because it's this really exciting thing. She leverages these really sophisticated quantitative techniques for making sense of these discrepancies that people really couldn't make sense of, and do it in a way where you say to yourself, this has potential. This way of looking at these discrepant reports could actually tell me a lot about kids' clinical presentations. What's next? What's your sequel like, Bridget? And so when you get to the sequel stage, after you get them excited, you can't end with just that movie. Your solar system is not a one-off. You need another story afterwards. You need to take the energy, you got them excited, you revved your audience's engine up. Now you want to keep that engine running, and then take the bit that you think they liked about movie one and try to move it into movie two. Find a study in your research program that has the same or similar kinds of elements that they liked from the first one. Now, once you got it, then you got to figure out, okay, I know the plot line. Now, what am I going to do to create a conflict here? This can't just be happy, 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 happy. No movies like that. No movies just happy, happy, happy. At some points, you got to make your audience a little sad or uncomfortable. Right? Now, you don't have to make that explicit during the sequel, but it has to be something you can capitalize when you get to the third film. So they're all interconnected in that way, right? So that twist, that kind of like that moment of discomfort could be a lot of things. It could be a limitation, a big, like a glaring thing that was present in your first two movies that then you resolve in your third movie, right? It could be a new direction you want to take your work, right? So, but the way to think about this is movie one set up movie two has to set up movie three. What's an example of movie two? About a year later, Bridget and I start working on a paper with a sample, an inpatient sample, that's collected out of Hopkins in Baltimore. And Elizabeth Reynolds and Rick Ostrander were our colleagues on this. A really fun paper to work on because it's a great group over there. They have this gigantic inpatient data set, hundreds of kids with cross-informant reports, similar to the scale and scope of the assessment that the study that Bridget did with Antonio. Only Antonio's was a school-based sample, so it's a very different assessment context. And here's the funny thing about this. So in Bridget's second movie, what we find is, so you can find structure in these discrepant reports, in these school-based assessments, but can this really work in an inpatient sample? I mean, these assessments are notorious for being unreliable, not valid. I mean, you can cite plenty of scientists who think, kid self-reports in an inpatient setting is terrible because they'll hide their issues, and then because they don't want to stay in the inpatient unit. Or you might find other researchers who say in their papers, I can't really buy parents' reports here. They're just going to over-report and over-endorse concerns so the kid gets help. We looked at those data, and it turns out you can find the same kind of structure in that inpatient sample that we did in the school-based sample. And in other samples, by the way, in samples of kids that have entirely different kinds of concerns. Autism, disruptive behavior, anxiety, like all these different kinds of issues have the same kind of underlying structure, or very similar kinds of underlying structure. And it turns out that you can use that structure to predict treatment characteristics. So some of these patterns, like the kid that endorses less problems than the parent does, we found that to be a marker for how engaged a kid was in therapy during the inpatient ward. They were more likely to be prescribed standing antipsychotics, so sedatives. They were more likely to be administered pretty intense intervention techniques like locked door seclusion. So in this context, that we really didn't quite think was the kind of place you would expect you to find a cohesive structure of these cross-informant reports, actually did not only wind up giving us a cohesive structure, but also a window into how these kids wind up responding to treatment while they're in the inpatient unit. So, we're going to move now into movie 3. Now, remember, movies 1 and 2, make people care, create a conflict, and those 2 movies are building up to this last one, this last movie. What does the last movie have to do? Well, I haven't told you yet, but there was a conflict embedded in that second movie that I'm gonna reveal now. But suffice to say that that's what you're doing, and what you're doing really with a trilogy, which you'll notice a lot of trilogies do. Remember, I mentioned that you to please look at this clip, this 30-second clip from the third Scream movie, from Scream 3. It's brilliant because it tells you exactly what trilogies do. Right? Trilogies do the following: they take you back to the beginning of the story, a place that you're familiar with, and they show you something that you didn't see before. All of them do that. Right? So that third movie you're selecting, that third study, the mission of that study is to reorient your audience back to where they came from the get-go, and show them something that was kind of under the radar. It's something that you thought was like an issue in the work, and now you're going to try to resolve it. Okay? Here was Bridget's issue. In each of those first 2 studies, as useful as it was to find structure in those 2 informants reports, we had access to that data in an archival sense. We didn't plan to get those informants. Most of us don't. Most of us just basically wait for the informants to come to us, for the teacher to send back their report, for us to really only use informants because that's what's available in the clinic. So it's not surprising that when we get these data, we didn't expect to collect it in a certain way. We didn't actually make an informed choice as to which informants we used. It shouldn't be surprising that when they come out discrepant, we're uncertain as to what to do. But what if you could force the reporters to disagree? What if you were to create a predictable circumstance of disagreement? You knew when people were going to disagree. You knew when people were going to agree. And you capitalize on the predictability of those discrepancies to do what you hope the assessment data does. Helps you make a good decision by your clients. All right. So a few years ago, in grad school, I read this article by Helena Kramer, brilliant a statistician at Stanford, and Helena Kramer's always right. And so in 2003, she presented a plan, way back in 2003, presented a plan for selecting informants. And what she basically said was, look, these people always disagree. In the clinic, in the laboratory, it's a really replicable phenomenon. So why don't we just create assessment batteries where we can make a prediction as to why people agree or disagree? She kind of sees it like a satellite. So if you take your phone, like go back, look at your phone, right? And you want to find a restaurant once we're allowed to leave the house again. Once you want to find that restaurant, if you walk around and you're using your app, that app, that global positioning app, really is triangulating on your position on your phone based in large part on whether or not there are satellites above you that can find you. And all of us have encountered those times when we walk and we're like, maybe we walk under an overpass, or we walk into a building, and we look at the phone and we're like, I'm not there, I'm over there. Like it can't find you anymore. And it can't find you because it can't figure out where all the satellites are relative to you. Because when you want to find an object or a person in space, you don't put all your satellites in one place. You triangulate on that position. You strategically place your satellites in different points in space. They overlap in some ways. They overlap in latitude, but not longitude. Longitude, but not latitude. One satellite kind of sits in the middle of the other two satellites. And it's in that triangulation where you optimize prediction. That's exactly what Bridget did in her study. What she did was she went to an area of research, social anxiety, where we always only ever rely on kids and parents to provide data. And it just so happens that in our clinical assessment studies, we collect a third informant, a fake peer. We have the kid coming in for the assessment interact with somebody that they're told is an unfamiliar, a same age peer, when in reality it's an undergrad from our lab that looks younger than their age. Kind of the way that Tom Holland does. Tom Holland, from the first time he played Spider-Man, if he got caught at a bar, he'd get let in, but he's supposed to be a 15-year-old. He was 21 when he first started playing Spider-Man. And so that person, that peer, sees anxiety in that kid in a way that the parent can't, and we know that based on our data. The parents' reports don't really predict all that well what's going on in that unfamiliar peer context. And in some respects, they're like two satellites that are seeing the kid from very different points in space, and the kid is kind of like a mix of those two informants. When they're rating their own anxiety, they're probably giving a mix of what a parent can see and what their peers can see. So there's some overlap in those two. And then relative to any other way in which we can assess anxiety, that triangulated score, the score that's based on the triangulated data, is telling us a whole lot about how they behave, in these laboratory settings and at levels that you never see in predictions of anxiety. Really, really high beta weights. Trilogies in film differ in one really important way from trilogies in research. Trilogies in film, the third movie is like wrapped up in a bow. No more stories to tell. We're done, right? A trilogy in research should reveal a hint. I got other movies in my plans going forward. There's some things I'm working on next, and so every great trilogy in a research program, like in a job talk, it includes an epilogue. Includes that time that you're planning, the things you're planning on doing afterwards. You have more stories to tell, so you hint at those. So your audience has to know that your research is not over, that you have more things you really want to do. So, an example of an epilogue Bridget might have, all the work that she presented during her 3 studies, all large samples. We're only looking at the average estimates of each of these kinds of measures that we're taking, but we don't know yet how to take those things we've learned at the sample level and dwindle them down to individual people, to make decisions, to make individual decisions in clinical work, to plan treatment. And then with the last study, we only know that this paradigm appears to work in our one sample at Maryland. It might fall apart some other places, and when it does, is there something we can do to modify or adapt to the circumstance? We don't know any of those things yet. So Bridget's got years and years of work left in front of her, and you want to make your audience know that that's a key element of your work. You're thinking ahead. Now, the nice thing about this is that then you can start expanding on what kinds of what are the ways in which you might be able to do that. What are some methods you might use to tailor the assessments to specific people, to specific clinical cases, to specific clinical contexts? Is there a way to take these data and personalize them so you can treat individual clients? Now, we walked through all this, and I mentioned before that I mentioned to Bridget. Look, I'm going to lay out a plan in this book that connects a few of your stories, a few of your studies together. And we didn't talk about this, but your job talk's in there if you want it. What am I hinting at? The big surprise of all of this is that when it comes time to prepare your research program, in all likelihood, you're doing all that preparation backwards. And I don't mean backwards like in year 4. I mean backwards like with just a few weeks before your first job talk. I'm serious. I mean, when you've seen a great talk, a great job talk from a really strong candidate that's in their last year of grad school or in their second year of postdoc, and it looks like they planned it in advance, they likely haven't. They planned it just a few months in advance. They practiced it, they honed in on it. But that's the way we have to do these things, because again, people in grad programs and postdoctoral training programs, where we were raised, we did not have complete control of our scholarly process. So by definition, that means we have to basically create our work, our stories, our larger trilogy post hoc. And the thing is that your audience expects that too. Your audience knows. You don't have the luxury of being able to plan these things years in advance. But nonetheless, how do you go back and find connections where you didn't know they existed before? That's something that all of us have to do as independent researchers, and they're going to expect you to at least be able to do that. So, for any of you who are within some time, in a short period of time going on the job market, what I'll suggest, do some homework. Is there what's your trilogy? You're a film producer. Get a mini audience together. Some of your fellow grad students in the lab, or postdocs if you're in a T32 training program. Find a few people who are willing to listen to you. I don't think you really have to do this for 45 minutes or however long a job talk is. In fact, at the awards ceremony, it's gonna happen in just a little bit. You're gonna see 3 short talks, like 8 to 10 minute talks, that where I worked with the award winners in advance of the ceremony, and we used a lot of these same tools to sort of build out those talks. It's only going to be about 8 or 10 minutes, and what I suggest they think about this is that if you tell a good enough story and you like the story, and there's only a little bit of time before you go on the market, all you got to do is stretch that 8 minutes to 45. That's it. It's like an abstract from one of your papers. So I would encourage you to try to start doing the same if you're at that point where you can look back and start connecting stories together. So we spent a big part of our day today. We set aside time, in this work from home context during the pandemic, and we talk a lot about some of the how-tos with a variety of different important topics in relation to academic work. And what I want to impress upon you is the idea that what's great about this process, what's great about figuring out how you fit within your mentor's story, learning how to produce work that then you can put together to tell your own story. What's effective about storytelling is that if you understand your work well enough that you can use these devices to communicate your work to other people, that person doesn't have to know anything about what you do. And that's how all these talks should be. When you go to give a job talk to a department of psychology, a school of social work, a department of education, you're in that environment, and some people have some idea of what you do, but most of them don't. And so storytelling allows you to shrink time. That person in the audience does not have to have spent several years like you did learning the things that you know. It allows you to be able to communicate information to somebody that doesn't require an expertise to understand you. And that's what makes movies great. Because in order to take in a great drama or a great action movie, do you need to know the entire history of action filmmaking or drama filmmaking? Of course not. No. That story should stand alone. And in many respects, this stuff's doing. The great thing about storytelling is that the easier it is for you to communicate information to somebody who doesn't know what you know, the faster it becomes to see how you might be able to work together. A lot of this work we do, and we're doing it in isolation with other people. We're reading on our own. We're running analyses on our own. We're writing on our own. But storytelling has a way of being able to connect people together who didn't know that they should be connected. And so it's also a great way to make the work fun. The best part of this job for me is that it allows me to create excuses to work with people who I really enjoy talking to and I really enjoy working with. So storytelling helps you do that. Thank you all so much for your time. I had a delightful time with you. Your questions were fantastic. You were so engaging. This is always as much fun for me as I hope it was for you.